Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. I'm the pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, California. Just about to end my 41st year there. But besides all that, we're doing Bible study here at the Marin TV. And we are going through the book of Acts. Acts was written by Luke, the only non-Jewish author of any New Testament or Old Testament book. He wrote the Gospel of Luke and this book of Acts. And by Acts, that means what was taking place in those very early decades. Now, we're in chapter 17, beginning at verse 22. And the title of that is Paul Addresses the Areopagus. I'm going to explain what Areopagus is in a little bit. So, he's in Athens, Greece, and that's a very famous place. This is the first time there's been a Christian message here, and he's going to be differentiating between the Christian message and Greek philosophy. This was an era prior to many centuries and centuries after, extraordinarily religious. I mean, over the top. It had so many gods and goddesses that were worshipped. It was really horrific. And here we are. The years are between 52 and 54 AD. So when it's taking place on what's called the Second Missionary Journey. And a large crowd is going to gather, and they had never, ever heard anything about Jesus. Now, let me explain a little bit what the Areopagus is. It was an ancient citadel located on a rocky outcropping above the city of Athens. And the Parthenon was near there. I've actually been there. My brother Bruce and I traveled there, and it was very interesting to see that and be a part of it. And so that's what was taking place. And so we're looking at Acts chapter 17, beginning at verse 22. Okay, I want to read a little piece that I got out of a Google search. It says, the Areopagus, also known as Mars Hill, is a prominent limestone rock outcropping in Athens, Greece, located immediately northwest of the Acropolis. Historically, it served as a meeting place for the oldest classical Athenian council and is famous in biblical history as the site of the Apostle Paul's unknown God sermon. Okay, so that's where we are at. And Paul's sermon, by the way, the commentators say, was very respectful, well-informed, and focused on idolatry or the worship of idols. It was huge. Okay, so here we are, Acts chapter 17, beginning at verse 17, again in Athens, Greece. And they would meet there in the afternoon, usually. They took time off in the heat of the day. Very interesting to read about life in those days. So he's now talking to Gentiles, and he's going to be talking about Greek philosophies, and in a very respectful way. Okay, verse 22 of Acts 17. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, I've tried to figure out what standing in the midst of the Areopagus meant, tried to picture it, but I'm afraid I never got it. But essentially, it's a hill. So someplace where they would gather, and Paul was right there in the middle of it. And here's what he said. Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Now, the Greek word for religious is theoron. It could mean pious, it could be superstitious, it could be religious, or about godly's talk. It's translated various ways. Okay. And he says, in every way. I mean, they were consumed by it. Verse 23, for as I passed along, I observed the objects of your worship. Now, there were many. There were just huge numbers of these, and there were statues and little things built for them to honor the different gods. And they were huge in number. Okay. So he said, I observed the objects of your worship. And the word objects is plural, many. Verse 23, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your ritual, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Now, my English Standard Version that I've used over the course of my ministry, probably about 6 different kinds of Bibles, RSV, King James Version, New American Standard, etc. I use the English Standard Version now, and it says the unknown God, but in the Greek, in the best Greek, it actually should read to an unknown God, not the unknown God. There's no edition of the Bible that is 100% correct. They estimate the ESV that I use between about 95 and 96% okay. But there's going to be the 4 or 5% maybe that is not exactly right. And this is one of the cases here because the best manuscripts, the oldest manuscripts actually have that to an unknown God. Then it says, what therefore, Paul says, what therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. Wow. Now, this is going to be the first time in the history of Christianity where we have this sort of thing taking place. Again, it's Paul's second missionary journey in the early 50s. Christianity is just beginning. And so we find it's very interesting to compare with what it was then and what it is now. I haven't time to go into all of that. But anyway, but he says, what therefore you worship as unknown? They didn't know. They had a God and a statue indicating a God that they didn't know about, an unknown God. They wanted to cover all the bases. He says, this I proclaim to you. So Paul takes advantage of what took place there. They had this statue to an unknown God. So Paul, I guess he's standing beside it. And he says, I'm going to tell you who this is. Now, verse 24. It says, the God who made the world. The God who made the world. What an incredible statement. The God who made the world. It just didn't happen. It was made by the deity, that supernatural power which we will never really comprehend even when we get to heaven. It's beyond our imagination or ability to envision. The God who made the world. Now, when it says the world, it wouldn't be just including Earth. It would have been including the entire universe. The entire universe. Can you imagine a God who could and did create the entire universe? I can see how some people say, no, it just was always existed like that. This is a basic reality, except that we know that it's either going to burn out or freeze out, and most of the theories say it's going to freeze out. It's just expanding into nothingness. And, disagree with me if you'd like. Those are just some of the ideas that current scientists have and think about on this point. So he says, I'm going to present to you who that God is. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord being master. Lord means the one who is absolute control, being Lord of heaven and earth. That would, in heaven and earth would include all that existed, all the stars, all the moons, all the planets, all the everything. Being Lord of heaven and earth does not live in temples made by man. But that's what people thought. The gods lived there. And when they would go there and offer their offerings, most of the time it was flowers, but other things as well. And they would clean these monuments, these little statues, they'd clean them off and place flowers at the foot, and it's a way of their honoring God, the God that they believed in. Or there were probably many of them. So he's going to proclaim, he says, who made this, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Therefore, it essentially negates everything about the Parthenon, the great temple on the Areopagus there. He essentially says, these are nothing. Now, I imagine myself standing there hearing this, and I would be a little bit overcome because you've just negated everything that I believe and my parents believed down through the centuries, and all these thousands of people here, you've just negated their whole religious structure and what they think. But that's what Paul did. See, we don't have the opportunity to see the look on his face, the sound of his voice, his gestures, the way he greeted and addressed. We don't have that. In my opinion, and in the opinion of others, he took a lower position, a very soft position. It was not accusatory or trying to say you're completely wrong. It was his message, his view. So he says, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, the rituals and so on, as though he needed anything. Cleaning, taking care of, being fed essentially, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Paul says we're talking about the Lord I believe in is the creator of all. The creator of all. Therefore, he said basically all the worships of all these gods and goddesses here, we're headed in the wrong direction. Verse 26. And he says, and he made from one man, that would have been Adam, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Now that is so complicated that there's no way I have addressing that. But he's talking about Adam. We're not talking about any kind of racism. So the Greek idea, they alone had the truth, and they had the best barbarians that they worship. From every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, and determined the allotted periods, in other words, appointed times and places, and the boundaries of their dwelling places. So it was essentially a respectful reference to all Greeks and all Jewish people. Verse 27, that they should seek God. That they should seek God. Indwelt in us is the desire for God. And that's in many of us, I suppose even atheists to some degree, to find some truth. How could this all be? How could this all be? Anyway, he created this that they should seek him. We are made to seek God. That's in all of us to some degree or another. Here Paul speaks of it and says, and perhaps, feel their way toward him and find him. In other words, they couldn't find him on their own. The word perhaps feel is the word grope. It could be translated grope. So that's how Paul sees the people, the humans of the world, are groping, searching, hoping to have a connection with the Creator or creators or the gods and the goddesses. That it's part of us. It's built into us. I remember in my own period of time when I rejected the idea altogether there was any such thing as a God. And I didn't believe there were God or goddesses or angels or any of that sort of thing until I became a Christian. And it says, perhaps grope their way toward him and find him. So there is a very interesting thing that God created us so that we would seek after something higher than ourselves, the Creator, in fact. And then he says, Paul says, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following. I haven't got the time to go through that. Verse 28. And then he's going to quote, now Paul's going to quote two guys. He's going to quote Athens, who lived about 600 BC, who wrote a hymn to Zeus. It was one of the old names for God. And here this guy, Athens, wrote a hymn, a song, and here Paul quotes it. To him we live and move and have our being. The idea is that God is close to us, not far away, not distant, not impossible to connect with, but in him we live and move and have our being. And then he goes on, as even some of your own poets have said. Now this is a quote from Areopagus, A-R-A-T-U-S, who lived between 315 and 240 BC, Areopagus, and here's what he wrote: for we are indeed his offspring. For him we are indeed his offspring. In other words, this Areopagus, about 400 years earlier, talked about the idea that we are that God has created us. Okay, so these are not Christians, these are not Jewish people, and but this was something Paul quoted because he figured that they would understand what he was saying. Okay, verse 29. Being then God's offspring, in other words, created by God. Without God, we wouldn't be here. We owe our existence to the creation of God by God. We ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imitation of man. This is how our idols were made. Some gold, stone, silver, and they would make ideas of this deity that they were worshiping. And like I said, there were hundreds of them, just hundreds of them. They were far more religious than we have ever seen or understood. So, and then in verse 30 says, the times of ignorance God overlooked. And the word times is chronos, that's chronological time, chronos. He says, the times of ignorance. Paul is able to say, you guys headed in the wrong direction, it's completely out of it. The times of ignorance God overlooked. But now, he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So Paul is right away moving on to that. I forgot to read two verses. One from Acts 14:16. Paul at Lystra says, in past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Then Romans 3:25. In his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. Now that's a big mystery. I'll be writing it in my new book, ending my new book called Mysteries tomorrow. And I'll be focusing on these verses. It's very, very interesting how it is. But he says the times of ignorance God has overlooked. You know, the idea that every person was born condemned at conception and then being baptized on the 8th day, that cleansed you from that sin. That did not develop for many centuries after the days of Jesus, the first century. And that is not at all a biblical truth, I'm sorry to say. But it's all have sinned. Sin is a knowing breaking of God's command. God says no, broke it. That conveys upon us a breaking of God's law. He has fixed a day He's going to judge. By how? By Jesus, whom He has appointed. By a man, He says, whom He has appointed. And of this He has given assurance to all by raising Him from the dead. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9 said, "Turn to God from idols to serve a living and true God." That's what Paul wrote, and you can almost say he's writing it to these people. I want to say it again. Turn to God from idols to serve a living and true God. Wow. This is an incredible thing. Now remember, this is a sermon that Paul is preaching, and he's now come to the end of it. At the end of verse 31 is the end of the quotation, and it says, "Of this He has given assurance." In other words, the proof of all of this is the resurrection of Jesus. Crucifixion, burial, resurrection. Jesus appeared to His disciples for 40 days. He will come back. And it's basically a part of what we find in Scripture. He will come back. Okay. And so Paul was absolutely against the Christians, against Jesus. And then he was miraculously converted. He was a Jewish Pharisee, big time. And he persecuted the Christians, something awful. But then he was converted. He became a Christian. And so now he understands what had happened because he knew the Old Testament, he knew the Hebrew Bible well. And so everything fits in for him. Now we'll go to verse 32. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, see, they believed in the immortality of the soul. Christians do not believe in the immortality of the soul. It's immortal. We don't have an immortal soul. The word for soul in the Greek is psychos. We get our word psychology from it. It means that we are created with the capacity to have a relationship with God. We don't have a soul. We are a soul. Someone who can connect with God. It's not the continual existence of a soul. Not biblical at all. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, of course, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." Okay, that's good. They had heard a message that challenged everything that they believed, everything that they knew about, severely challenged them. But they didn't walk away, they didn't throw rocks. So Paul went out from their midst. Some went out from their midst. Okay. Of course, that's always going to happen. That happened to me for a period of around a year, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2 years. But I was that way. I went out from their midst. I didn't want to talk to these Christians at all. Anyway, verse 34, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius, the Areopagite. Now that's Areopagite. This is a big place where everybody met. It says, and a woman named Damaris and others with them. Now, Dionysius was, it is found in a couple of places that he had become later on the bishop or the pastor of the Athens Christians. Dionysius. And the woman Damaris, who was a God-fearer, not a Jewish person, God-fearer, a Gentile. And Chrysostom, one of the early historians, says that she was the wife of Dionysius. They two kind of going together. I'm going to go that direction. Now, it's interesting, there was no mention of any baptisms at Athens, no mention of a church being planted there either. We find that not present in this passage, but we know that it eventually did. In closing, we are indeed living a very real history. And there will be good times, there will be the not so good times, and so there will be success, there will be failures, both on a personal method and collectively as well. That's just the way it is. So I have to say I'm just so blessed to be a follower of Jesus, and despite all the ups and downs, we continue on with being followers of Jesus. Being a follower of Jesus is not an easy thing in the world we live in, not at all. You have all the confusing things that go on in Christianity. If the devil be busy, let me tell you, the number one target are Christians and churches and anything to do with Christianity, guaranteed. I've been a Christian long enough. I became a Christian, I was 21 years old, and that's 63 years ago. I'm an old dude. And I have seen the good, I have seen the bad, I have seen the ugly. Let me tell you, I've seen it and been part of it. I have contributed to some of the bad parts of it. This thing of being a follower of Jesus is no simple thing in our world. And it takes a lot of courage, a lot of faith to keep on identifying with our Lord Jesus Christ and with His people. Whether we believe with them all the same, no. There's no two of us Christians who believe all exactly alike. We all differ from one another. And that's good, and that's healthy, and it actually means strength. So we're not forced into having to accept just all the things that somebody says. All right, that's the end. So long.